Texas town hall last night, and the estrogen levels were enough to give Chuck Norris menstrual cramps. I wonder, is our strength our diversity?
Our strength is our diversity. We've been talking about this for years as a country of immigrants, and we let them define the issue on immigration. We let them define the issue on DEI, and we let them define what woke is. We got ourselves in this mess because we weren't bold enough to stand up and say, you damn right we're proud of these policies. We're going to put them in, and we're going to execute them.
So, wait, you lost because you weren't woke enough?
Tim Walz, the governor of Minnesota, found himself at the center of a storm of sarcasm, facts, and unapologetic mockery when Greg Gutfeld took to live television and absolutely dismantled everything from Walz's policies to his personality. This wasn't just a critique, it was a full-blown roast, and Walz looked like he didn't even bring oven mitts to the barbecue. From the moment Gutfeld opened his mouth, it was clear that Walz wasn't going to leave unscathed. What followed was a relentless takedown of Walz's leadership, behavior, and attempts to act like he's got things under control when everything around him is spiraling. Right off the bat, Gutfeld made it clear that Walz was not just wrong, he was in over his head. He compared Walz's presence at a recent Texas town hall to estrogen levels so high even Chuck Norris would get cramps. That's the level of satire Gutfeld brought to the table. The metaphor was brutal, and it set the tone. It was like Walz had stepped into the ring wearing glitter sneakers while Gutfeld was wielding a chainsaw of comedy. Every moment that followed only added more fuel to the fire. One of the most hilarious and damning points Gutfeld made was how Walz handled immigration and diversity. While Walz delivered his usual spiel about how diversity is strength and how immigrants make up the foundation of America, Gutfeld tore right through the rhetoric. He pointed out the irony of these well-rehearsed lines being delivered by a politician who, in practice, seemed completely lost. It was like Walz read Leadership for Dummies and decided that would be his playbook for life, except instead of Leady, he was just stumbling from one policy disaster to another. Gutfeld then turned to a long-standing controversy, Walz's military background. Apparently, Walz once claimed to be an official bikini inspector in jest, but the truth was even more troubling. According to his former superior, Walz knew his unit was about to be deployed to Iraq and decided to resign behind everyone's back. Veterans weren't amused, and neither was Gutfeld. He used this revelation to illustrate a pattern in Walz's behavior-dodging responsibility while painting himself as a hero. When asked about the incident, Walz reportedly tried to distract everyone with, "Hey, look over there," and ran. Gutfeld summed it up by saying Walz might actually win the coward vote. Brutal but effective. If political leadership were food, Gutfeld said Walz would be the bland mashed potatoes no one ordered, but still mysteriously shows up, just sitting there, tasteless, useless, and somehow still present. That's the kind of metaphor Gutfeld used to hammer the point home, and people weren't just laughing, they were nodding along. Then came the critique of Walz's economic policies. Gutfeld tore into the way Walz looked at inflation, unemployment, and businesses leaving Minnesota, and somehow concluded that more taxes would help. It was like watching someone look at a house on fire and thinking, let's throw gasoline on it and see what happens. Gutfeld joked that Walz might as well start taxing oxygen, smiles, and people thinking about moving to South Dakota. Under Walz's leadership, businesses were fleeing like the state was haunted. And what did Walz do? Increase bureaucracy and red tape, of course. Next, the conversation turned to crime. Gutfeld didn't hold back here either. He compared Walz's approach to public safety to handing scented candles to people in a burning building. Instead of tackling rising crime with seriousness, Walz decided to blame society, hold hands, and hope criminals would be swayed by interpretive dance. It was laughable if it wasn't so dangerous. Gutfeld practically screamed through his sarcasm, painting a picture of Minnesota as a place where law enforcement had been replaced with mindfulness workshops and TikTok campaigns. And speaking of TikTok, education under Walz became another target of Gutfeld's fire. Once a teacher himself, Walz has overseen what Gutfeld called the transformation of Minnesota. Classrooms into performance art studios. Instead of math and science, kids were being taught to spot microaggressions and construct safe spaces with popsicle sticks. Gutfeld said students weren't passing traditional tests anymore. They were ACing the How to Be Perpetually Offended exam. Teachers weren't educators. They were now facilitators of feelings and curators of grievance culture. Then there was the bizarre anecdote about Walz during the riots. He allegedly called someone in the White House panicking that his house was being surrounded by people with American flags. The person on the other end tried to calm him down, asking if that was a good thing or a bad thing. Walz wasn't sure. That was the level of paranoia and confusion Gutfeld wanted to highlight. This is the man, he said, that Minnesotans had entrusted with leadership, someone who sees a crowd with flags and panics instead of seeing citizens exercising their rights. One of Gutfeld's most brutal critiques was of Walz's COVID-19 policies. During the pandemic, Walz reportedly shut down businesses, fined churches, and arrested bar owners, but allowed massive protests in the name of political alignment. Apparently, the virus respected ideology. That's how inconsistent and hypocritical the decisions were. Gutfeld mocked this double standard, saying Walz governed like a man auditioning for America's next top authoritarian. But perhaps the most stinging jabs came when Gutfeld turned to how Walz spent the state's surplus. Instead of returning the surplus to taxpayers, Walz expanded bureaucracy and spent it like a toddler with a credit card. Gutfeld joked that he probably bought a taxpayer-funded mural of himself looking contemplative. The money, instead of easing the burden on the public, went to new diversity consultants and gender equity retreats. The man turned red tape into an art form. Starting a lemonade stand in Minnesota now needs more permits than opening a casino in Vegas. There was also Walz's strange obsession with Gavin Newsom. Gutfeld said it's like Walz sees California's disaster and thinks, let's do that here, but make it colder and less efficient. Wasn't leadership, it was cosplay. Walz was performing as a progressive hero, but tripping over every department he touched, and transportation. Don't even start. The bullet train project he championed was so slow and mismanaged, Gutfeld joked it might be completed around the time dinosaurs come back. Gutfeld also brought up Walz's constant contradictions. When asked about crime, Walz would start talking about bike lanes. When asked about the economy, he'd pivot to gender-neutral parking lots. It was less about solving problems and more about delivering woke TED Talks and slideshows about healing through ukulele circles. This wasn't governance, it was interpretive policy theater. The sarcasm didn't stop there. Gutfeld said Walz's speeches sounded like a GPS stuck in recalculating mode. His media appearances were like watching a man pretend to be competent while drowning in jargon. It was rambling, endless, and totally disconnected from the problems Minnesotans actually face. Watching him try to explain policy was like witnessing a raccoon try to tap out Morse code while wearing oven mitts. And then came the issue of stolen valor. Walz was accused of misrepresenting his military rank, an issue Gutfeld didn't let slide. In a city like Minneapolis, where looting seems legal, lying about military service might not raise eyebrows. But to veterans and the public, it was deeply offensive. Walz dodging questions and pivoting to other topics only made things worse. Gutfeld said the man doesn't just pivot, he pirouettes like a ballerina on 5 Red Bulls. In closing, Gutfeld painted Walz as the embodiment of every failed leftist policy wrapped in a flannel shirt and kombucha energy. He might talk like a down-home farm dad, but his actions scream elitist bureaucrat. Gutfeld said Walz is the kind of guy who shows up at a tailgate party with vegan hot dogs and asks if the brisket is locally sourced. He doesn't represent the working class. He represents tofu at a monster truck rally. Ultimately, this wasn't just a political critique. It was a comedic autopsy. Gutfeld didn't just criticize, he exposed the absurdity of Walz's leadership with scalpel-sharp sarcasm. From education to the economy, from crime to COVID, Walz's policies have been a disaster. And Gutfeld laid it all bare in one of the most brutal televised takedowns in recent memory. Walz might still hold office, but after this, he'll be doing it under the long shadow of Gutfeld's roast, a reminder that even in politics, sometimes the truth comes wearing a smirk and holding a mic. If there was ever a lesson in how not to lead, Walz has written the manual. And if there was ever a moment when political satire became more honest than political speech, Gutfeld delivered it. This wasn't just entertainment. It was reality, sharper than fiction and more painful than any late-night monologue could capture. Minnesota may recover. Walz's reputation. It's another story entirely. And so the beatdown didn't end with just policy failings or absurd leadership. Gaff's Greg Gutfeld kept peeling back the layers of Tim Walz's career and personality, until all that was left was a confused figure in a rumpled suit who looked like he'd walked into the wrong press conference and just decided to start talking anyway. Gutfeld wasn't just delivering zingers. He was holding a mirror up to every failed experiment in soft-on-crime, woke-obsessed, economically incoherent governance that Walz had championed. The issue of education became another brutal arena where Gutfeld didn't hold back. He brought attention to the transformation of Minnesota schools under Walz's tenure where